Did you know that over 1,600 people vanish in the American wilderness every single year? Most are simply labeled as lost, presumed dead from the elements. But locals near Blackwood Mountain know the terrifying truth. The woods do not just hide the lost, they actively hunt them. On a freezing January evening, 4 college students, Mark, John, David, and Sarah, made a decision that would curse their lives forever. They ignored the physical barricades and rusted warning signs, pushing deep into the restricted northern ridge of the Appalachian Trail. The temperature was plummeting rapidly. Every breath formed a thick cloud of white mist in the dead, silent air. This was not a normal winter chill. This was a bone-piercing cold that felt entirely unnatural. A heavy, suffocating atmosphere that settled over the forest like a funeral shroud. Mark led the group, his headlamp slicing through the pitch-black darkness. The jagged rocks and dead, twisted trees looked like skeletal hands reaching out from the frozen earth. For the first 2 hours, the hike was filled with nervous laughter and the crunching of hiking boots against gravel. But as they climbed higher, the forest grew completely, utterly silent. No wind. No wildlife. Just a dead, vacuum-like emptiness that made their ears ring. Suddenly, the beam of Mark's headlamp caught something sitting on a large, flat boulder just off the main trail. 2 figures. 2 men sitting completely motionless in the freezing dark. They wore thin, tattered clothes, completely unsuitable for the freezing weather. The group froze, the laughter dying instantly in their throats. One of the men stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the empty darkness of the tree line. The other man slowly turned his head. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely hollow. He stared directly at the group, his face completely devoid of any human emotion. As John nervously tried to walk past them, the man who was staring forward spoke. His voice was not normal. It was a dry, rasping whisper that seemed to echo directly inside their skulls. "Do not go any further." John stopped dead in his tracks. "Why?" John asked, his voice trembling in the freezing air. The man did not look at him. He just kept staring into the dark void of the woods. "I am telling you for your own sake. They are already waiting. Turn back." Nervous and eager to prove their bravery, the group brushed off the chilling warning. David laughed nervously, assuming the men were just dangerous drifters looking to scare tourists. They quickened their pace, leaving the 2 strange figures behind in the absolute blackness. That was their first and deadliest mistake. As the group descended into a narrow valley between 2 towering peaks, the darkness became absolute. The headlamps barely pierced the gloom, creating long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and writhe on the rock walls. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was not just a paranoid itch. It was a heavy, crushing pressure pressing down on their spines. Sarah abruptly stopped walking. Her face drained of all color. She pointed a trembling finger toward the top of the ridge, hundreds of feet above them. Standing at the very edge of the cliff, silhouetted against the pale moonlight, was a figure. But it was not human. It was impossibly tall, easily over 8 feet in height. Its limbs were unnaturally thin, dangling at its sides like broken, elongated sticks. The entity was entirely black, absorbing the faint light around it like a dark void. It had no face, no features, just a towering, skeletal silhouette staring directly down at the 4 friends. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. The sheer terror paralyzed their muscles, locking their joints in place. David instinctively raised his high-powered flashlight, aiming the blinding beam up the cliff face. The bright light hit the exact spot where the entity was standing. But the cliff was completely empty. The towering nightmare had vanished without a single sound. Panic erupted immediately. "Did you see that?" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking with pure terror. John was gripping his hiking poles so tightly, his knuckles were completely white. "Keep moving," John muttered, his eyes wide with panic. "Do not look up. Just keep moving." But the nightmare had already latched onto them. From the deep woods directly behind them, a sound shattered the dead silence. A crunch, crunch, crunch. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Something was following them, and it was closing the distance rapidly. The heavy crunch of boots on frozen gravel echoed through the blackness. A crunch, crunch, crunch. Whatever followed the group made no attempt to hide. The entity wanted the terrifying presence known. Panic consumed Mark, John, David, and Sarah. They broke into a desperate, stumbling run, breathless lungs burning in the freezing air. The headlamps bounced erratically across the treacherous rocks. To the right, a steep drop into an endless, black abyss. To the left, jagged cliff walls. There was nowhere to hide. Have paranormal entities ever invaded everyday life? Drop a comment below right now if a terrifying ghost or unexplained paranormal event has ever been encountered. Because the next events on Blackwood Mountain defy all human logic. After 20 minutes of agonizing running, the narrow path violently opened up into a desolate, rocky plateau. The group stopped, gasping for breath, shining beams of light across the barren landscape. Right in the middle of the clearing were 3 elongated mounds of earth. They looked exactly like freshly dug graves. The sight alone was enough to freeze blood inside the veins. Why would graves exist at the top of a desolate mountain? Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with trembling, frozen hands. Standing just 10 feet behind the 3 graves was a figure. It looked like a normal man, but the body remained completely motionless. The figure did not look at the bright headlamps shining directly on the spot. The head remained bowed, staring intently at the mounds of dirt. "Identify yourself," John yelled, the frightened voice cracking violently. The figure did not flinch. No breathing could be seen. It just stood there, looking like a discarded mannequin in the dead of night. Then it slowly raised a hand and pointed a single, long finger directly toward a dark cave entrance on the next ridge. The group did not wait to see what else would happen. They sprinted in the opposite direction, abandoning the main trail entirely. Absolute terror pushed the hikers to absolute physical limits. They finally collapsed near the base of a massive, rusted electrical pole. It was an ancient relic from a long-abandoned mining operation. The ground was flat. This was the only place to set up the tent. Hands shaking uncontrollably, Mark and John unpacked the canvas tent. Every few seconds, someone shined a flashlight into the surrounding tree line. Nothing but twisted branches and suffocating darkness stared back. David grabbed the firewood from the bag. A fire was desperately needed, not just for warmth, but for protection. The human mind craves the safety of light when hunted by the dark. The wind howled violently, blowing out match after match. 10 minutes passed. 15 minutes. Finally, a small flame caught the dry bark. The fire crackled to life, casting an eerie, flickering orange glow across the terrified faces of the 4 students. For a brief, fleeting moment, a false sense of security washed over the camp. They huddled around the flames, shivering violently. But something was terribly wrong with David. While Mark, John, and Sarah whispered frantically about the towering entity and the man by the graves, David sat perfectly still. He was not shivering. He was not talking. His eyes were locked completely onto the dancing flames. His face was entirely blank. And no fear. No exhaustion. Just a hollow, empty shell. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked softly, waving a hand in front of David's face. David did not blink. He slowly turned his head to look at Sarah. "Yes," David whispered. But the sound did not resemble David. The pitch was too low. The tone was completely devoid of emotion. It sounded like a dark presence mimicking human speech. Before anyone could say another word, David suddenly stood up. He walked over to the heavy backpack, unzipped the fabric in absolute silence, and pulled out a gallon jug of drinking water. Without warning, the cap was unscrewed, and the entire jug of water dumped directly onto the roaring campfire. A massive hiss of steam erupted into the air. The protective orange light died instantly. The camp plunged back into absolute, terrifying pitch-black darkness. "Why do that?" Mark screamed, scrambling backward in the dark. David dropped the empty plastic jug. In the pitch-black, freezing night, David's cold, dead voice echoed perfectly. "The light makes the targets too visible for the hunters." The campfire was completely dead. Only the sickening smell of wet ash remained in the freezing air. Total darkness consumed the desolate campsite. Mark, John, and Sarah dragged David into the canvas tent, their hands trembling violently. David offered no resistance whatsoever. The body moved like a wooden puppet suspended on invisible strings. Once inside, the heavy zipper was pulled shut. The 4 college students sat in a tight circle on the freezing floor, surrounded by pitch-black nothingness. No one dared to turn on a flashlight. David's chilling warning echoed endlessly in the silence. "The light makes the targets too visible." Time lost all meaning inside the suffocating dark. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., the sounds began. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was the distinct sound of heavy boots dragging against the loose rocks just outside the thin canvas walls. The group stopped breathing entirely. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Whatever was out there had found the camp. It began to circle the tent, first on the left side, then slowly moving to the back, then circling to the front. The horrifying pacing continued for 20 agonizing minutes. It was stalking the occupants, waiting for a single fatal mistake. John's hands shook violently as a smartphone was pulled from a heavy coat pocket. Desperate for any form of spiritual protection, John opened an audio file of a recorded psalm, an ancient prayer meant to ward off demonic entities. The holy words filled the small, freezing tent. Instantly, David violently seized up. David's head snapped upward, eyes wide and completely feral in the faint glow of the phone's screen. "Turn it off," David hissed, the voice contorted with pure, inhuman rage. The three friends recoiled in sheer terror. "Turn it off now, or the entity will enter." The threat hung heavily in the freezing air. John scrambled to pause the audio, the screen quickly going black again. Absolute silence returned. The heavy footsteps outside had stopped completely. But the relief was fleeting. A smash. A massive, jagged rock slammed violently into the side of the tent, nearly tearing the heavy canvas. Sarah screamed, pressing herself flat against the frozen ground. The strike was so powerful, it shook the entire metal frame. But outside, there was no sound of anyone running away. Just dead, empty silence. Paralyzed by an unnatural, crushing exhaustion, the group huddled together in the freezing dark. Extreme fear actively drains the human body of all energy. Despite the sheer terror, exhaustion forcefully dragged Mark, John, and Sarah into a shallow, restless sleep. Mark awoke with a sudden, violent gasp. The air inside the tent was inexplicably colder, biting deeply into exposed skin. Mark turned a terrified gaze toward the front of the tent. The heavy zipper was pulled all the way open. The tent flap was flapping wildly in the violent mountain wind. David was gone. Panic erupted instantly. Mark shook John and Sarah violently awake. "David is missing," Mark shouted, the words instantly shattering the dead silence. The three students scrambled out of the tent, clicking on their heavy flashlights. The beams of light sliced through the pitch-black night. "David!" John screamed into the howling wind. No response. The campsite was entirely empty. Sarah pointed the beam of light toward the edge of the plateau. Just 30 feet away, a sheer, vertical cliff dropped hundreds of feet down into a black abyss. A terrifying thought paralyzed the group. Did David wander off the edge in a sleepwalking trance? Trembling with pure dread, the three friends slowly crept toward the edge of the terrifying drop. The flashlights illuminated nothing but empty air and jagged, deadly rocks far below. "David," Sarah whispered, tears freezing instantly on pale cheeks. But then, a sound emerged from the absolute blackness. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps were returning. But they were not coming from the safety of the main trail. The sound was coming from directly below them. Someone or something was walking straight up the vertical, impossible cliff face. The relentless crunching against the vertical rock wall grew deafening. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Mark, John, and Sarah stood completely paralyzed at the edge of the abyss, their flashlights shaking violently in their hands. Two blood-soaked hands suddenly gripped the icy edge of the cliff. A figure slowly, mechanically, pulled itself over the jagged precipice. It was David. But a human being cannot scale a 300-foot vertical rock face in the dead of winter without safety equipment. The physical impossibility of the act shattered the minds of the onlookers. David's fingernails were completely torn away, leaving dark, freezing trails of blood smeared across the pale stone. His eyes were rolled entirely back into his skull, exposing nothing but sickly white sclera. "David, where did you go?" Mark asked, his voice trembling with pure, unadulterated terror. David did not answer. He simply raised a violently shaking hand and pointed a single broken finger directly down into the pitch-black abyss. Then, the lifeless body collapsed face-first onto the frozen dirt. Terrified, freezing, and operating purely on adrenaline, the three friends dragged David's heavy, unconscious body back into the fragile canvas tent. Trust was completely gone. David was no longer acting like a human being. He was a vessel for whatever haunted Blackwood Mountain. Using thick nylon climbing rope, John tightly bound David's wrists and ankles together. The other end of the thick rope was tied directly around John's own wrist. If David tried to sit up or escape again in the dead of night, John would be instantly alerted. The heavy metal zipper of the tent was pulled shut once more, locking them inside a tiny fabric cage. Inside, the air grew so incredibly cold that thick white frost began forming rapidly on the inside of the canvas walls. Every breath stung their lungs like inhaling shards of broken glass. No one spoke. No one slept. They simply sat in the suffocating dark, staring at the unseen ceiling, praying for the dawn to break. But the cursed mountain had no intention of letting the intruders leave. At precisely 3:15 a.m., the violent howling of the wind abruptly died. The dead, vacuum-like silence returned, heavy and oppressive. Then the footsteps started again. But this time, it was not just one solitary set of heavy boots dragging across the gravel. It was multiple sets. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The terrifying sounds surrounded the tent entirely. Heavy, dragging steps paced back and forth, just inches away from the thin fabric separating the students from the nightmare outside. Sarah clamped both hands over her mouth, biting down on her own fingers to muffle her terrified, hysterical sobbing. John, trembling violently, desperately reached into a heavy coat pocket for the smartphone. The audio file of the protective psalm was opened again. John pressed play, turning the volume to maximum. The holy words echoed loudly, piercing the freezing night air. But this time, the reaction was horrifyingly different. Instead of driving the unseen entities away, the footsteps instantly multiplied. The slow pacing turned into a frantic, chaotic, deafening stomping. Dozens of unseen figures began rushing the tent from all sides. The canvas shook violently as unseen, freezing hands slapped frantically against the outside fabric. The holy words were not protecting the camp. The words were actively enraging the hunters. Suddenly, the chaotic, deafening noise stopped entirely. Dead silence fell over the mountain peak once more. The anticipation of an attack was psychological torture. Mark could not take the terrifying unknown any longer. Slowly, agonizingly, Mark unzipped the small mesh viewing window at the front of the tent and peered into the pitch-black night. Standing directly outside the tent, mere inches from the thin mesh screen, was a towering entity. It was the exact same impossibly tall figure seen earlier on the cliff ridge. The body was over 8 feet tall, with limbs unnaturally elongated and completely skeletal. It wore tattered, rotting clothing that reeked intensely of wet earth, copper blood, and ancient decay. But the face was the absolute most horrifying detail. It possessed no eyes. It possessed no nose. There was just a wide, gaping, black hole where a mouth should be, stretched impossibly open in a silent, eternal scream. The fear was absolute. It was a primal, paralyzing dread that bypassed rational thought and sank directly into the bones. The entity's skin, illuminated only by the faint, ambient moonlight, looked like gray, stretched parchment over jagged bones. It radiated a cold, so profound that the mesh window began to instantly freeze over with thick layers of ice. The towering nightmare did not attack. It simply stood completely still, staring directly down at Mark with its empty, black void of a face. The faceless nightmare stood mere inches from the thin mesh window. It did not move. It did not breathe. The terrifying temperature drop caused the very air inside the tent to crackle and pop, freezing the moisture in their lungs. Mark, paralyzed by pure terror, could not pull his eyes away from the gaping black void on the entity's face. Then, a sickening sound shattered the silence inside the tent. A snap. John and Sarah snapped their heads around. David, lying bound on the frozen floor, had just effortlessly snapped the thick nylon climbing ropes binding his wrists. The heavy ropes broke as easily as brittle, dry twigs. David sat bolt upright in the pitch-black darkness. His head snapped toward the back wall of the tent. He did not look at his friends. When David opened his mouth to speak, the voice that echoed out was a horrifying chorus of 3 distinct, raspy whispers speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. The soil is ready. The 4th must join. Before anyone could react, David lunged backward. With unnatural, demonic strength, bare hands ripped entirely through the heavy canvas wall of the back of the tent. The fabric tore open with a deafening screech. David crawled out into the violent, freezing wind, sprinting completely barefoot into the absolute darkness, heading directly toward the high plateau where the 3 graves sat. Outside the front window, the towering, faceless entity slowly turned its massive, skeletal head away from Mark. The heavy, dragging footsteps surrounding the camp immediately shifted direction. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Dozens of unseen things began following David into the black abyss. They were no longer hunting the camp. They had successfully claimed what they came for. The horrific realization hit Mark, John, and Sarah all at once. This was the only window to escape. "Run!" Mark screamed, the voice tearing his frozen throat. "Run right now." Everything was abandoned. The tent, the supplies, the flashlights, everything was left behind. The 3 college students scrambled out of the shredded canvas and sprinted blindly down the treacherous, jagged mountainside. There was no trail to follow in the pitch-black night. Adrenaline masked the agonizing pain of sharp rocks slicing through their heavy boots and tearing at their frozen skin. They slipped, fell, bled, and kept running. Every time the wind howled through the dead trees, it sounded exactly like a chorus of agonizing screams echoing from the mountain peaks. They did not stop for 3 grueling, torturous hours. Lungs burning, muscles tearing, and entirely covered in freezing mud and their own blood, the tree line finally broke. The faint, gray light of dawn was just beginning to bleed across the horizon. Below them lay the paved asphalt of the state highway. A lone logging truck rumbled down the road, and Mark threw himself wildly toward the pavement, waving frantically. The screech of heavy air brakes was the most beautiful sound ever heard. The police were immediately notified. Search and rescue teams, complete with tracking dogs and a state helicopter, scoured the northern ridge of Blackwood Mountain for 5 consecutive days. The abandoned campsite was easily located. The tent was completely shredded. The heavy climbing ropes were found snapped into pieces. But the tracking dogs behaved entirely unnaturally. Whenever the handlers tried to lead the dogs toward the high plateau, the highly trained animals violently refused to move forward. They whimpered, tucked their tails, and lay flat on their stomachs in the freezing dirt. A specialized team eventually pushed forward without the dogs, hiking to the barren, rocky clearing. The police report filed later that week contained a detail so deeply horrifying, it was never released to the local press. The officers found the 3 elongated mounds of dirt resting exactly in the center of the plateau. But the dirt had been disturbed, and right beside the original 3 mounds sat a freshly dug, perfectly shaped 4th grave. No body was ever recovered. David was completely consumed by the dark, ancient forces hunting the woods. Mark, John, and Sarah survived, but the psychological scars never healed. They never hike. They never enter the woods. And they never, ever sleep without every single light turned on. Because sometimes, in the dead, freezing hours of the night, the faint sound of heavy boots dragging across gravel can still be heard outside their bedroom windows. A crunch, crunch, crunch,